The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Well, we're back, folks. We had a little miscue, but go ahead, Sarah. You can talk about what was going on with Satchel Paige up in the mid northwest, or actually midwest north.
Yes, exactly. So sorry. But yeah, Satchel was, as always, incredibly dominating on the field, and as always, incredibly provocative off the field. He was, according to many accounts and according to his teammates, he was involved with white women in North Dakota. You know, he wasn't going to take a sabbatical from his romantic relationships during his time in North Dakota, and that got him into some trouble with locals who did not appreciate his involvement, particularly because these were interracial romances. So, he won a lot of support from the fans in North Dakota, but that support dissipated once word got out of his dalliances outside of the baseball field.
Yeah, and Satchel is just one of those guys. I think you mentioned in your book Dizzy Dean, and he wanted to literally paint Satchel Paige white so he could pitch. That's how good he was. But
and then they could stop at the 4th of July. They'd win the pennant by the 4th, and they could go fishing the rest of the season, I believe, was the rest of Dean's plan.
Dizzy Dean, God bless him, he died young, I think. I think he died around the time that I was born, 1970, but great announcer as well. But I think Dizzy Dean hit it on the head, just like a lot. Even the Babe, he loved playing the African Americans and stuff like that. But I think with Dizzy Dean, he made a point. Culture is keeping these great players out of the Major League Baseballs. And what people don't understand and what people need to understand is that the Negro Leagues that were formed because they could not play in the Major Leagues was a huge contribution to African American society. I'd like you to talk about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that Effa Manley got into a lot of trouble for being willing to talk about after the beginning of integration of Major League Baseball. But these teams were the central, a central touchstone for so many cities, for so many Black communities. Not only were they an economic engine for those towns, those cities, those communities, bringing in money and attention, they were also a source of community pride. They were a community meeting place. When you read memoir after memoir, autobiography after autobiography about families who had as a regular part of their week that they went to church on Sunday and then they went to a ball game and they went as a family, and that was a continuation of their community fellowship. And so these teams were a source of pride, a source of financial opportunity, and a source of identity for Black people during, a time of incredible stress and discrimination, and at a time when, because of the Great Migration, you have massive numbers of newcomers to these mainly northern cities, not always, but mainly northern cities. And it allowed those new migrants to also hook on to something that allowed them to feel connection and identity with their new homes, and to revel in the success and the extraordinary talents of these Black men on the field.
When we associate baseball, you hit upon it in your book. You hit upon masculinity, I love that, I just butchered that, masculinity and, manliness, but there was differences, what constituted a masculinity and a manliness for both the African-American sports and the white sports. What are some of the differences?
Well, and it depends on, who's talking, right? So how, Black communities defined what masculinity and manhood meant was different than what was going on in white communities. And for these Black players, they had these extra burdens of what it meant to be a man that were very much shaped by the larger societal pressures. So within the Black community, to be manly meant this very difficult juggling act of being physically strong, being accomplished, being financially successful, but above all else being respectable. And respectable meant, how your public comportment was, what your behavior was. You had this extra burden of being without public flaw, of not doing anything that would invite criticism, because particularly for Black men who were in the public sphere, any sort of scandal was thought to be not only a personal problem for them, but a blow to the entire community and to hopes about racial progress and ending segregation and discrimination. So this burden was incredibly heavy. Yet at the same time, among ordinary kind of Black folks, there's also this desire to see the success, this manly success that's about being a trickster, about winning one over on the people who have power over you. So, it was incredibly difficult and generally impossible for any one person to, embody all of those characteristics at once, which reveals the way in which this racial discrimination just created this an almost unbearable burden for Black men in the public sphere.
Excuse me. Yeah, I agree with you. Now, even with the different societies here, we have Rube Foster, we have the Negro Leagues. We're getting to the point now where this becomes an organized league. Because again, basically, as we mentioned in our last podcast, not a lot of the games were recorded. So it's hard to say, look, Josh Gibson hit 800 home runs. I believe it. If you ask me, I believe it, but not every home run's accounted for. Now, let me ask you this.
Right.
What is your take on Kennesaw Mountain Landis? And do you think he vehemently opposed, Negroes coming into the baseball world, and Landis is given a dark picture, and I'll give you my take after I hear yours.
Well, after we talked last, I did some more reading, because Landis is someone who I'd read about from mostly the perspective of the Black press, than on his own. So I read particularly the Saber summer 2009 kind of take on Landis. And I think in that I agree with Richard Crepeau. I read his name, but I don't know how to say it. But I think Landis certainly could have and should have done more. I think he did not shy away from being the kind of public bulwark of the gentleman's agreement by his public statements, but I think we probably do need to look at him in a much more nuanced manner in terms of the rest of his history and his personal background. But I think it's that fine line, and with everything, it's much more gray than it is black and white. That he could have done more. I would say he should have done more. I understand the context of the time, but he's making him the one and only villain also doesn't truly reflect what was going on.
You're absolutely right on that. I want to give you my little dissertation. After we got off the phone last time, and I continued my research on Landis for my book. I came across his personal papers in Chicago History Museum, and I had a law student running around out there for me and got me a lot of information. And what I've learned about Landis, and this is very important because, he made decisions that were arbitrary. Like he would punish the 1919 Black Sox, but he wouldn't punish Ty Cobb and Tris-Speaker, and people just get generalizations off of it. But I know for a fact, Landis was put on the circuit court. He was appointed by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905. During that time, you had the whole antitrust busting going on. We're going to break up the big stuff. Brandeis, one of my favorite justices. He's like, look, Standard Oil, too big. I mean, Landis threw at John D. Rockefeller $39 million fine for collusion against the antitrust laws. Landis was a progressive, but he adhered, and this is where it's important, no one knows about this, he adhered to a judicial philosophy known as judicial realism. And what judicial realism is, it's different than the old way of doing law, the judicial formulation where you look at a statute and you say, yes, the law says this inside the box, this is how we're going to roll. Landis was of the class, along with Brandeis and Holmes to a degree, that, look, the Constitution is elastic. It can be stretched from whatever the Founding Fathers said in the 1770s to modern day, but you have to see what modern day is thinking about, because we don't think like colonial times. And what part of judicial realism is the judge weighs not only the law, but he relates to public sentiment. He relates it to what the press is thinking. He's relating it to which side is going on. How is society changing here? So when you have that, when you have a Black Sox scandal where the court say, well, you guys are exonerated, we lost the evidence, I don't find enough evidence, we know you did it, we just can't convict you, Landis said, no. You're putting a black mark on the game that I love. Public sentiment won't deal with it. A court may exonerate you, but I'm not going to exonerate you. Now, in the 1930s, now in 1927, both him and Ban Johnson got huge raises before Ban Johnson was knocked out of his position after the Ty Cobb Tris-Speaker affair, when Landis really became czar of baseball. Landis took a 40% pay cut in the 1930s. Now, baseball was hurting. And in those days, you didn't have TV, you didn't have radio, contracts. The biggest source of income came from the gate receipts. The gate receipts were not coming in because no one could afford leisure like baseball. And so the owners all went to Landis because Landis threw it out to them. In fact, Landis had abolitionists in his family. He had abolitionists in it, just like Ty Cobb did. Cobb was proven in Charles, he's going to kill me, Charles Learson's book, Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty, that, look, he wasn't the racist people made him. Landis was not racist at all. The problem was he loved baseball, and he took public opinion into account, and he took gate receipts into account, and he took the owners into account. St. Louis would never play, with him, and so he didn't do enough for integration because he saw it as it would hurt baseball and baseball receipts. That's why people misundertake. But this stuff isn't even told in books. It's going to be told in my book. But with the material I found, Landis was arbitrary, yes. Landis was about self-image, yes. Landis wanted the public to think that he cleaned up baseball, which he really didn't because there was still gambling going on. But he picked and chose what he wanted to do for public sentiment. And one of the public sentiment was not integrating because it's going to hurt baseball. And he died, and Happy Chandler, they all give their credit to Chandler. What people don't know, there was a law in New York that was passed that said, look, you can't discriminate in the workplace, between black and white. And that freed up Brand Tricky to go out and say, now is the time to do it. But getting back, and I hope you like my little dissertation there. It's really a show about your book. Because I could go on forever. Me and you could stand here all morning and do this podcast, but we just don't have time. But going to the 1944 World Series review, we got a picture over here from the Negro Baseball Pictorial Yearbook. They're showing them throw a baseball, but they're using Japanese soldiers throwing a grenade here. What's the parallel?
So it's in World War II, one of the things that was really important for all black communities was demonstrating patriotism. Like you talked about previously, black community leaders really pushed the idea of, and the Pittsburgh Courier, of this double V campaign that you could win against fascism abroad and against racism at home, that the valiant service of black servicemen would be rewarded. And one of the things that F.M. Manley and many of the Negro League owners did repeatedly was trying to tie their teams to charitable works to benefit the cause, to selling war bonds, to doing things for the war effort. So you had people like Manley leading charitable works, and you had a real public relations effort by Negro League teams to publicize the sacrifice of their players, of the many Negro League players who fought in World War II, who were drafted or who enlisted. And so with this pictorial yearbook, you have a Grays pitcher getting ready to release the ball, and then you have a black serviceman behind him getting ready to release the grenade. So the connection between black baseball as a boost for morale, as a American symbol of freedom, and the sacrifice of black soldiers, they're making the same argument that the white leagues are making during World War II, that we're a patriotic industry, we're a patriotic sport, and our cause is aligned with the greater patriotic cause of World War II, of the American fight in World War II.
And you know something? World War II, like we mentioned earlier in the show, a lot of people in the black community saw it as, hey, this is a great opportunity coming up. Let's talk about F.M. Manley, because we can't do without F.M. Manley. I mean, she's in the Hall of Fame, for God's sakes.
She is, and she really was one of the most visible and both visible and behind the scenes workers during World War II in terms of Negro League baseball. She was honored in different black periodicals for her charity work that all had to do with selling war bonds and raising money for the war effort. She really understood. She more than almost anyone had a really strong understanding and could see all of the angles that were playing out during almost every occasion, both during World War II and during integration. And she also, though, was working behind the scenes. And you go to the Hall of Fame and you start reading through files, you can find letters where she was writing, trying to get her players out of service, trying to suggest and trying to, in many cases, request that she didn't think that they should have been called up for the draft, or she wanted to get them an alternative assignment. As much as she was playing the public relations game of patriotism during World War II, she wanted to ensure that she could put on the best team that she possibly could, and that she had her stars, because she wanted to keep those gate receipts up. So she was kind of playing both ends during World War II.
Now, Emmy, let me ask you something. Was she was part white, wasn't she?
According to, I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but according to biographies and her own account, she was white, completely white. That her mother, if I'm remembering correctly, was white. Was this correct? Now I'm going to get confused. But yeah, her mother was a white woman married to a black man, and that she had an affair with a white man, and Effa Manley was the result of that, is usually the story that is told. But that she grew up in a biracial family, with biracial siblings who considered themselves black, and a black community, and she considered herself black even though genetically or by kind of parentage she was white. And she does talk about in her autobiography and stories about passing, or at least presenting as white in certain situations when she needed access to segregated spaces, but then kind of assuming a black identity during the rest of her life. And she's honored by magazines as one of the, however many most prominent black women, despite the fact that she seemingly may have been a white woman.
And you know what's interesting about her, Effa, was that, yes, she couldn't wait for the day that there would be integration, but she got what she wanted, but not the way she wanted it. She wanted these teams to integrate. She didn't want the major leagues to handpick the best players out of the Negro leagues because she knew the Negro leagues would just go downhill, economically, because all these guys are jumping to the white major leagues, and now you're taking our best players, and what do we have?
Right, absolutely. She saw that it was going to be the destruction of these Negro League teams, of her business. And at the same time, she had been in favor of obviously, integration and progress moving forward, but she knew that it was coming at this horrible cost, and that it would be, she could foresee, and it's what happened, that for years and years it's only the very best, only the best black players are going to be chosen, and you're going to have racial quotas on teams. And that means you're going to have this system where who's left in the Negro Leagues? It's the, qualified, many cases qualified for the major league players, but average journeyman players rather than the stars. And that meant that black fans were going to shift their allegiances and go to see the Indians or the Dodgers rather than the Eagles or the Monarchs.
Yeah, and that's what happened. Now, you know what's interesting about
Exactly.
Effa? You know what's interesting about Effa that you wrote in your book? She had a copy of Andy Razaf's Ain't Misbehaving. I love that song. Tell me about Andy Razaf and his influence on the Negro culture here.
Oh, yeah. So Razaf is really fascinating because, again, it intersects with this complication with World War II, where you have a desire by so many in the African American community to prove their patriotism. Yet at the same time, you have people like Razaf who had been working during the 1930s on their music, and a lot of it was about, anger, about the ways in which racial discrimination was harming their communities, and, wanting to express that culturally through song, but not being able to get money or support for music that had a more explicit political message. And so in World War II, Razaf takes some music he had previously written, We Are Americans Too, that was much more explicitly a kind of racial critique, and he changes it to be about celebrating black contributions in American history. And so he is, trying to both point out the ways in which those contributions had not been honored, and at the same time celebrate the accomplishments of particularly Black men at this crucial moment for the country as a whole.
And you're absolutely right. We think of the protest songs like, Bob Dylan and, Creedence Clearwater, but they have you ever listened to Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday? Oh, my God. How much more powerful is that? All the lynching that occurred in the 30s and early 40s. But here's something that really caught my eye from your book. Tricksters and folklore in Black baseball. What are we talking about with here?
So tricksters, there is a long cultural history among Black communities about and going back to kind of African cultural traditions about the idea of a trickster, that within communities you tell stories about these figures who may be disadvantaged in some way, may be small in some way, but always manage to win out over the bigger, more powerful group. So sometimes it's small animals winning out bigger ones. In the case of Black baseball, they take this idea of the trickster and use it to really celebrate people like Satchel Paige, these Black players who were at a big disadvantage. As wealthy as well as Satchel Paige does, he can't during the 1930s and until integration get access to the big stage, and so they tell and retell these stories about ways in which their sporting heroes managed to get one over on white authority figures, white society, striking out, white players during barnstorming, making their way across country in really fast cars and showing up the police officer who's the white police officer who stops them. Those stories allowed Black communities to really celebrate these small victories as a sign that this white supremacist ideology maybe could be taken down, maybe could be countered by ingenuity, which is really what it's all about. It's about how to best take the tools you have and win when everything's stacked against you.
And what's interesting, getting into the tricksters, because now we get into a favorite topic of mine, the Zulu Cannibal Giants and the Indianapolis Clowns. Many people don't realize Hank Aaron started with the Indianapolis Clowns in the early 1950s. I think Tony Stone was on the team. A couple of other, two other women who eclipsed my mind were also on the Clowns, I believe.
Yeah.
But these were big crowd drawers, gate receipt. You look at the Zulu Cannibals and how they dressed and how they looked with the face paint. It reminds me of, if you ever seen the original King Kong, the natives there. The makeup,
yes.
The makeup is similar, if not exact. Let's talk about marketing. What I like to put pretty much reverse discrimination here and capitalizing on it.
Yeah, that's what the players who really were in these clowning teams. The clowning teams, really kind of varied even from year to year in terms of how demonstrative they were in terms of what they were doing, whether it was just things like shadow ball or whether it was the full face and makeup and costuming. It could vary year to year, season to season. But absolutely, when many of them were under a lot of pressure and attack from the Black press, when we get back to that issue of manliness and masculinity and respectability, dressing up in grass skirts was obviously not seen as respectable. And what you hear from the players who participated is that, one, they were getting to play the game that they, loved. They were getting paid for it. And two, they felt that they were functioning kind of as tricksters, that if there were white fans in particular who were dumb enough to buy into these stereotypes and come and pay for the privilege of it, why shouldn't they take their money? Why shouldn't they financially profit off of the racism that had been, propagated for so long? They saw it as, in many cases, as kind of karmic justice, that they were fulfilling, kind of living down to these stereotypes, that they were forcing white patrons to pay for it, and that put them up ahead.
Well, you know what's interesting, though? The clowns and the Zulu cannibals, I think, were in the late 30s and 40s. The clowns went well into the 1950s.
They did.
Before the disintegration of the Negro Leagues in 1960. Let me ask you this question. When did the promised land for African Americans in baseball really hit? And let me just clarify my question, because it's a very, very open-ended question. The last team to integrate was the Boston Red Sox with Pumpsie Green in 1959, 12 years after Doby and Jackson got into the league in 47. Up here in Boston, the racism here continued with Jim Rice. It continued with the basketball players. Bill Russell's house was burnt down during the 1960s while the Celtics won the championship. When do you think that African Americans received equality in baseball?
Oh, goodness. I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I mean, we can look at a variety of moments. You look at that really infamous, there's a famous or infamous 1960 Sports Illustrated article where they talk to black players, at that point, which is nominally 13 years after integration, but really only 1 year after the Red Sox finally integrated. And they talk about how sidelined the players feel, that they don't feel like they're truly part of the game in a meaningful way, that they are discriminated against in the clubhouse and outside. And, you think of today and the numbers that I know. There's been a million thought pieces about it written about the low participation by African Americans in baseball today, and what the reasons for that might be. You can find a bunch of different theories. It's kind of hard to say if we've gotten to that point in a real sense. Obviously things are much better in baseball currently, but it was such a slow integration process, and it much like in any other sport, what we also see is the access to those higher levels of management and coaching have been really difficult. That they've been hard for people to come by. We don't see as much diversity, just even in the front offices or anywhere in baseball. So, I'm not sure that we've found the promised land yet. There's obviously huge amounts of progress that have been made, but it's still a really complicated landscape in terms of baseball and race, especially when it comes to African Americans.
Yeah, I don't think they reached it either, for that matter, but it's gotten a lot better, Dusty Baker. I love Dusty Baker, Frank Robinson. Bill White became National League commissioner in 1989. It's gotten better, but now with an influx of the international community, because baseball's become a global sport, there's less African Americans playing than there has been ever before in baseball, because baseball has fallen off the rungs of America's pastime, unfortunately. Little leagues are down. The poor and poorer. Homer Bush, who was a former Major League Baseball player, he works with the Texas Rangers now, was on the Yankees in Toronto. He is sponsoring stuff for inner city kids to clinics to go and, cultivate their skills into baseball because we are losing this. Everything that these setup men that your fantastic book talks about is now going out to sea. It's not going, not here anymore. Japanese, Hispanic players, international players are becoming the thing of the sport. And so now I can just imagine what kind of scam baseball's pulling now, after going through the collusion scam of the 80s and steroids and the cocaine of the early 80s. And,
yes.
And, Bud Selig and all this stuff that's going on. I can just imagine what's going on now that we'll read about in a few more years. But your book is so relevant and so intertwined with what currently goes on. I can't thank you enough for producing such a wonderfully researched book. I had a joy reading it. I hope you had a joy being on my show.
Oh, I did. It was wonderful. Thank you again. I'm really grateful for you promoting my book and for giving me the opportunity to have this great conversation with you.
Yeah, it's always good to have you on the show, Sarah. Hang on the line. Let me end the show. I'll talk to you for about a minute after the show. Folks, go out, get the setup men, race culture and resistance in black baseball. Before I end it, Sarah, anything that I leave out that you maybe wanted to tell the folks?
I wasn't expecting a question, but no, read my book, get in touch with me. I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Well, that's the beauty of the show, Sarah. I do cross-examination, You go on someone else's show, it's all choreographed. I don't choreograph any of this. I don't even know what the next words are going to come out of my mouth. But let me close the show anyway. Folks, I had a great time with Sarah. I love when the authors, they give their honest take on questions that they're not prepared for. Because you know why? You learn a lot. I learn a lot. It's baseball. It's classic baseball. It's all good. Go out. Get the setup, man. Put it into your holiday planning. Give the love of baseball to any fan who is a baseball fan. Spring training is only 3 months away, so I'm still planning for that. But I got a lot of work to do to that point. Always, God bless you, folks. As always, I am Ian Kahanowitz. You are listening to Genesis on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.